I think that it's about time that I do a video doing a deep dive and breakdown of what feminine dominance is based off of the sexual polarity quadrant and using some Jungian terms, because I like to do that. Lately I've been talking a lot about the anima, right? I've been talking a lot about the anima. And as far as the 4 stages of the anima, as well as like the split anima, like the Madonna whore complex, these different things, right? Now, what do I consider feminine dominance, narcissism, certain dark triad traits, right? What do I consider that? What I really consider this as is what we first need to understand is that there is a dominant and there is a submissive ego, right? There's a dominant and there's a submissive ego. And we all have both. We all have both. Now, one thing we have to understand is that the ego is a social survival instinct. And what do I mean by a social survival instinct? We have the hippocampus, we have the amygdala. You know what the amygdala does? The amygdala will alert us, sometimes giving us feelings of primal panic, releasing certain hormones into our bodies that give us this reward or give us this punishment, right? We get cortisol, we get dopamine, we get these different hits to our egos based off our interpretation of the things that we observe and the things that we experience in comparison to life around us. Now, when this is properly oriented, then we can create positive feedback loops that help us in the trajectory of our lives. No one is completely separate from the ego. The only person who is fully separated from their ego is a dead person. But what is feminine dominance, right? What is feminine dominance? Feminine dominance is when you desire and crave for your dominant ego to feel as if it is in a positive position from a place of emotion, from a place primarily that's from hurt, from a place that's primarily from having a very fragile ego and a hypervigilance when it comes to the way that you see and interpret things in life. This is where feminine dominance comes from. See, feminine energy is something that corrupts dominance. Understand that. Dominance is not wrong. It's not wrong to have a desire to be in a positive position in life, right? It's not wrong to want to feel wanted. It's not wrong to want to have your desires met. It's not wrong to want to be in a position where you feel competent. There's nothing wrong with this, right? But when you attach that to another person, right? When you attach that to another person and are unable to either integrate your, because the feminine aspect is the connecting function, right? That's the eros. The masculine aspect is the principled aspect, right? This is where the principles come from. It's the masculine, right? This is where the structure comes from. And the feminine aspect is the connecting aspect, right? So how do I define masculine versus how I define feminine? Now, I'm not an expert, right, on Jungian psychology. I'm not an expert on clinical psychology, right? I'm not an expert on these things. I'm not a clinician, right? I'm not a college professor as of yet. But what I'll say is this: how I define feminine is the connecting function. To be feminine means that I want you more than I want to do things my way or in a principled manner, right? I want you more than I want my principles, right? More than I want to stick to my morals, more than I desire to stick to my standards, and more than I care about if you want me in return. That's what it means to be feminine, right? So what does this mean? When I'm breaking down the sexual polarity quadrant, an important concept to understand and keep in mind is that there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that. And we have to understand core polarities as well. We have to understand core polarities because just because a person is in one stage of polarity within the quadrant doesn't mean that they can't move spaces. So I'm going to break this down a little bit, right? If your core polarity is dominance, as in dominance is the most important thing to you, You want to feel as if you're in a positive position, right? And there's core polarities and there's fixed polarities, right? If your core polarity is dominant within the sexual polarity quadrant, then when you're in a high cup space, you're going to be masculine dominant, meaning that you would have a preference towards making yourself intrinsically desirable and interacting with people who desire you for the things that stroke your dominant ego, right? So what would be a great example of masculine dominance, right? Mode one, Alan Roger Curry's way of looking at dating and relationships, of being direct about what you want and knowing how to make yourself desirable for that outcome. That's masculine dominance, right? I think that's really one of the greatest examples that you will see within breaking down these different concepts and archetypes, right? That's one of the greatest examples that you'll see is of masculine dominance would be mode one. Then what are the other spaces that we have? Then you have feminine dominance. And there's different levels of feminine dominance. Sometimes it can have some good aspects to it, but oftentimes it will not. Most of the time it's not, right? But what feminine dominance really represents to me is narcissism. And how do I look at narcissism? Narcissism is when you have a very fragile sense of self and a very fragile ego, and you desire too much of your sense of self and too much of your sense of validation and self-worth, and too much of that is derived from feeling as if you're in a position of power when it comes to other people, right? So what strokes the ego, the dominant ego? It's narcissistic supply, it's validation. But everyone has certain levels of narcissism within them. Remember, the ego is a social survival instinct. So while feminine energy is something that corrupts dominance, right? Feminine energy is something that lubricates submissiveness to experience domination, to crave and to experience domination. So many people will view all forms of dominance and wanting to dominate a partner as something that is inherently wrong or inherently narcissistic. It isn't true. You can operate out of masculine dominance, right? Create that desire within that person to set certain standards and certain values to be secure within yourself, but to want to offer an experience. To be willing to walk away if they do not desire that experience, right? Or to know how to make yourself attractive for the outcome that you desire. It's masculine dominance. But when we're looking at narcissism, it's when you get to the place where, let's say we're talking about the shadow self, right? See, most people are going to be masculine submissive. And understand that whatever place you're at within the sexual polarity quadrant, the opposite is within you. So if you're masculine submissive, typically what you're going to be repressing is your shadow, right? Because you're operating mostly out of the persona, right? Operating mostly out of the persona and then trying to enforce that persona onto your ego to stuff down your shadow puts you into a position where repressing your shadow leads to your shadow overtaking you, and it causes it to govern your life without your permission, which leads to feminine dominance arising, right? Important concept to understand. So what does the shadow consist of? It consists of your aggression. It consists of, and what masculine dominance does, what masculine energy does to dominance is that it channels it, it concentrates it, it gives it principles, it gives it direction, it gives it focus, right? That's what masculine energy does to your dominance. What is that? That is the integration of the shadow. The integration of the shadow, right? But something to understand is this. Once you come in contact with the shadow, if you're unable to integrate that shadow into your principles, if your reflex is to get addicted to the experiences and the expressions that come within the shadow self, then this dominant ego, this addiction to the dominant ego, is something that will oftentimes lead to feminine dominance in moments where you do not feel that someone is receptive to you. Right? So what does that lead to? Wanting power and control by any means necessary. Right? Wanting power and control by any means necessary. Now, what's another aspect of feminine dominance, right? Or what's another aspect of the shadow? Our sexual urges and our sexual desires, right? So once a person gets very deep into feminine dominance, they're in a stage where their shadow has overtaken their ego, right? The shadow has overtaken the ego to the point where you're willing to lie, to coerce, to force, maybe to sexually assault or to beat an individual, right? To want to control an individual who does not desire to be controlled. Now, there's nothing wrong with desiring control, because you can control from a place of leadership, right? Where a person desires your leadership, they desire your guidance, and then you give them guidance and you give them direction, right? But something else to understand is this: just because someone desires it today doesn't mean they're going to desire it tomorrow, doesn't mean they're going to desire it a week or a month or a year from now, and it doesn't mean that they're going to desire it 5 minutes from now, right? And this is where the core polarity conversation is so important. If your core polarity is dominant, then you may be direct with an individual, and then once you notice them becoming shaky off of their stance of desiring your domination, then you may get into a stage where now you feel you have a free reign to manipulate them. You want to punish them outside of the confines of what's been agreed to within your dynamic, right? And what do I mean by the dominant ego being overreactive? What I mean by the dominant ego being overreactive is that when too much of your own self-esteem is predicated upon the responsiveness, the reactiveness, and the receptiveness of other people, then you start to set a precedent that's going to be unrealistic. And it might be the smallest things. And this is one thing about the game, right? This is one thing about the game. Once you get into the game and you start to integrate your shadow and you start to come in contact with your shadow, as a man, you start to learn to identify signs of receptiveness in women. You start to become more knowledgeable and more sensitive to observing a woman's body language, observing the tone in her voice, observing the things that she says, observing the pace and the consistency of the way she texts. You observe the small little details and the things that she may post online. You observe how she carries herself, how she dresses. And you learn through tapping into your dominant ego that some of these predatory instincts that we naturally have as human beings, because both men and women have them, but we have them in somewhat different ways. See, a woman within her dominant ego is more so having a desire for attention, right? It's more so about having a desire for attention, for a validation, non-sexual validation. And sometimes something to understand is that when you are in feminine dominance, sometimes what you want is to have both the sexual and the non-sexual control and validation separate from even if you're offering both, right? So this is how these things can take place. So oftentimes someone who is in feminine dominance, they say, okay, cool, what is the best strategy I can use to get this particular person? Maybe I should love bomb them. Because if they just desire you for what you want and they don't give you the other sides of themselves, you may not feel like you're getting the same level of validation out of it. So you say, okay, let me love bomb them, or let me be inconsistent. Let me play games, right? And that's something else to understand about feminine dominance is that oftentimes it can come out due to covert contracts being broken, right? This is the repressing of the shadow. And then when it overtakes the ego, right? It's like you have an agreement or an arrangement or an unspoken covert contract of how you believe someone should interact with you. And then when they break that, you want them to feel what it is that you feel. Right? This is where a lot of feminine dominance comes from. So important to understand core polarities. Now, fixed polarities would be like masculine dominance, and you're not going to interact with a woman unless she's being feminine submissive with you, and if she's not, then you leave her alone. Simple. But something to understand is this: if you are in a long-term relationship, that other person is not going to be feminine and submissive with you 100% of the time. Very important concept to grasp and understand. They're not going to be feminine submissive with you all the time. So what does that mean? That means that once you form an emotional connection or an emotional attachment to an individual, and you desire the sustaining of a relationship, then feminine energy within you is being infused into that relationship in a way to where you're going to have to use an extreme amount of willpower or have an extreme affinity towards your principles in order to make sure that you don't go into feminine dominance. So that means that once your emotions, and typically the emotions for a man is going to be somewhat connected to his ego, once your emotions get involved with the woman and you begin that process of integration, you also have to develop your anima, right? You have to develop your anima and go through those stages, right? Because you can be masculine dominant with the woman, right? But, and just operate from a place of dealing with the woman who sexually desires you intrinsically and she respects you. Cool. But on an emotional level, your emotions may still be transactional, right? In a way that may make it difficult for that to be sustainable. So you would have to learn to create different principles beyond masculine dominance to integrate the feminine into your masculine in order for a relationship to work over the long term. Because understand that having masculine dominant principles over a long-term relationship begins to come off as feminine dominance, right? Start to come off as feminine dominance. Because in a long-term relationship, things happen. Sometimes a person may not have the energy for something someday. Sometimes they may meet someone else and be interested in them for that period of time. Sometimes things may occur where they go through something in life, where they're unable to meet up to the same expectations that had previously met up to. And if you're somebody who wants to just keep going from person to person to person to person, then that's cool. But eventually you're going to reach a place where age is going to denigrate some of your dominance, right? And as you go through experiences in life, you're going to come to a place, hopefully, where you become more integrated and developed within your own anima, right? Because if not, then life is going to humble you. And you may experience ego death in many occasions. See, when I talk about narcissism, everyone has certain levels of narcissism, right? Everyone has certain levels of it. Not every person is going to be a clinical narcissist. I think the highest percentages I've seen of that is 3 to 6% of the population, or 2 to 6%. But although I've seen things that said 2 to 6%, most of them I see are like 0.5 to 2% of the population are clinical narcissists. But narcissism is something that can occur within an individual once they feel that the masculine, submissive, socially programmed idea of how they should interact with the person, this idea, this contract in the mind gets broken so many times that they lose faith in operating with people from a place of principles. And when they lose faith in operating with people from a place of principles, coming into contact with feminine dominance from others, you have to understand that there's masculine submissive within feminine dominant, and there's feminine dominant within masculine submissive. Once this has been broken so many times, you lose trust in principles, your shadow takes over, and then you operate out of the shadow for a period of time. And this is where a lot of people become heartbreakers. This is where a lot of people begin to use others. It's like, let's say you poured out so much of yourself without receiving anything in return. And your ego is in a place where you feel taken advantage of. Eventually, your cup gets low, it implodes. And then from that place of that implosion, you get to the place where you shut down. And let's say you shut down and then you see people chase after you. Let's say that you go through a breakup and then you meet someone new. And the new person you meet, you're not emotionally available enough for them to reciprocate for you to reciprocate their interests. And you notice that this is causing them to experience limerence because they're wrapped up in the idea of you. Then you realize that for most people, masculine submissive on masculine submissive doesn't create polarity. It doesn't create sexual passion. It doesn't create desire. For most people, it doesn't work like this. On the beginner level, on the basic level, the most common level of the sexual polarity quadrant, most people are going to be between masculine submissive and feminine dominant. So feminine dominant creates a pseudo level of polarity where both people have some levels of codependency, right? So it's like the feminine dominant is operating out of the dominant ego to desire validation, right? And the masculine submissive also desires validation, right? Important concept to understand. And oftentimes what the feminine dominant can look like is the dismissive avoidant. And the masculine submissive can be the insecurely attached or the anxiously attached, right? And the thing to understand about masculine submissiveness is that it's such a stagnant and baseline level of interaction that they don't get to experience intrinsic desire and intrinsic reward towards others. And they also don't trust the intrinsic desire and intrinsic reward towards themselves, right? And one thing about the masculine submissive as well is that they value the validation of an individual based off of how much they have to do to get it. But if an individual is direct with them about what they would have to do to get it, then it would take away their need to reason within themselves how to get it done, right? And this is also where the feminine dominant comes out within the masculine submissive, right? See, the masculine submissive can't get with the masculine dominant like that because it's conflicting principles and foundations, right? So the narcissism within a person is where they're predicating their desire for validation from a low cup space on the power and control they can exert over others, how admired they feel by someone else, how much validation they receive, how much control they receive, rather than having a higher sense of self that isn't predicated upon that. Now, one thing I said in a previous video is that you can only maintain masculine dominance if you either have a high enough sense of self and self-respect and you are stuck to your principles on a high enough level, or if you have an extremely high level of talent and or competence. Why is that? Because when it comes to masculine dominance, you have to be intrinsically desirable and you have to be respect worthy, right? The feminine dominance seeks pseudo respect through limerence. Because what is one way that I define respect? One way that I define respect is to desire and to value the opinion and approval of another person, right? To value the approval and the opinion of another person. And there's levels of respect, right? You can respect someone as a sentient being. You can respect someone as a person. You can respect someone as a masculine figure, and you can respect someone as a leader, right? Very important to understand. And those are 4 different levels of respect. When you respect someone as a sentient being, You see that they're alive. You see that they're conscious, right? When you respect someone as a person, this simply means that you don't desire harm to come their way, right? And you know that they have feelings, and you know that they have thoughts. You don't necessarily know that those thoughts are rational or valid or logical, but you know that they have thoughts. When you respect someone as a masculine figure, you respect that they have the ability to have a word and to stick to it, right? You respect their capacity to stick to their word. That means that their principles are something that are so solid that you believe that they will stick to their principles regardless of the circumstances. That's respecting someone as a masculine figure. Now, respecting someone as a leader comes from a standpoint of respecting their security level, right? Respecting that you can see their principles are not only solid, but that you're not responsible for their emotions, right? You're not responsible for how they feel, yet you respect their principles. You can respect someone as a masculine figure without respecting them as a leader. Like if you approach a woman and you're very direct about your sexual intentions, she can respect the fact that you were upfront with her, and she may even decide to have sex with you. But if she looks at your principles and who you are as a man and your standards, and doesn't see that you're integrated well enough to not have a fragile ego about her living her life and being who she is, and that you seek to control her rather than just having principles and structures for the way that you interact, then it will be nearly impossible for this woman to be able to respect you as a leader, right? So what does feminine dominance do? Feminine dominance takes that feeling of using weakness within a person's ego. It plays on their insecurities. It plays on their weaknesses through the predatory instinct that is within people, that is within the shadow. It takes that aspect of human nature, right? And it uses this playing on an individual's weakness and their ego, their insecurities, to elevate themselves to a position of being respected as a leader for a short period of time. And does this through playing off of an individual's childhood wounds, playing off of their insecurities in a way to where once you hurt an individual's ego who is insecure, then you replicate the childhood wounds that they have. And once you hurt the childhood wounds that they have, one thing about human nature is that once someone's childhood wounds have been hurt by a new person, it takes them right back to the person that they were as a child if they felt rejected or felt unheard or felt unwanted, right? And by playing off of this, then if you give them just a little bit of validation, playing off of their childhood wounds, then this little bit of validation that you give them, this breadcrumb, it will soothe that, and then you become the focal point of their desire for validation, becoming a pseudo leader, but not based off of the reality of your ability to lead, not based off of the reality of your principles and your character, not based off of the reality of your security and your capacity to help them self-actualize, not based off of how strongly you stick to your principles, but simply based off of their insecurities. Now, the thing to understand about feminine dominance is that once an individual becomes more secure within themselves, they will no longer want you, right? So while they're in that state of limerence with you, right? While they're in that state of limerence with you, everything that you want is yours. The world is your oyster, right? But once they get secure enough, they're going to interpret your actions and see you for who you are. So when you're in feminine dominance, you have to keep a person in a space of feeling small, feeling beneath you. You can't actually lift a person up, because the moment that you humanize yourself, or the person views you as more human, the moment that they feel as if you're more real to them and not an idealistic personified figure of whoever it was that rejected them in their childhood, soothing that, periodically and intermittently, then they're able to get over you, because it's not based off of intrinsic desire and intrinsic reward. It's not based off of respect for you. It's simply based off of wanting to soothe their insecurities. And I think that there are a lot of men who find themselves in a position, and women as well, who find themselves in a position where being the object of limerence is something that soothes their insecurities from childhood, right? Being the object of someone's desire that's based off of idealism is something that soothes their insecurities from when they felt rejected. And that's why I say that there's a certain level of codependency within both the feminine dominant and the masculine submissive. There's a level of insecurity. The masculine submissive wants the validation of feeling wanted by someone who has rejected them, right? Very important. The feminine dominant more so wants the validation of an individual who is willing to forego all boundaries and to betray everything in their life to want them. Because the thing to understand is that the feminine dominant doesn't really desire the feminine submissive. The feminine dominant doesn't view an individual as attractive if they truly are available and receptive on the level that they would desire. They lose interest when an individual is too available. They lose interest when an individual sees them and likes them for who they are and is sexually attracted to them and desires them, but isn't from a place of insecurity. The feminine dominant loses attraction to feminine submissiveness, and also the feminine submissive isn't attracted to the feminine dominant either, because the feminine submissive is seeking not only intrinsic desire and intrinsic reward for the sexual aspect. This is speaking of a woman who's feminine submissive, but the feminine submissive is also seeking to dock the boat of that feminine connecting desire to masculine energy through which guidance can be given. Remember, the recipe for feminine submissive is desire and respect, right? And the recipe for masculine dominance is the good D and the guidance. Remember, this extends beyond just penis, right? But it's desire and respect, good D and guidance, right? So the feminine submissive is not going to be able to stay feminine submissive with the feminine dominant. The feminine submissive, if that's a core polarity feminine submissive, will eventually, if the core is feminine, then the feminine submissive will eventually become feminine dominant themselves once their cup gets low, because they're being depleted. So once the feminine submissive's cup gets low, dealing with the feminine dominant, right, then they will then mirror the feminine dominance, right? And they will begin to manipulate the insecurity of the feminine dominant, right? Very important to understand. The masculine submissive may also begin to mirror the feminine dominant. The masculine dominant may simply walk away, right? And the feminine dominant, with the feminine dominant, they'll just keep playing games with each other until somebody goes somebody or something bad happens. Very important concept to understand. Very important to understand. So I'm giving this breakdown of feminine dominance because I think it's an important concept to understand, right? I think it is. So this is Coach Brody, the feminine dominant breakdown. And also I'll say this too. The feminine dominant is attracted to the boundaries, to overcome the boundaries through force or manipulation, right? Very important to understand that. Feminine dominance is attracted to masculine submissiveness, and masculine submissiveness is attracted to feminine dominance. Now, why isn't masculine submissiveness attracted to masculine dominance? Because they have conflicting masculine principles, right? The feminine dominant allows the masculine submissive to be the masculine foundation of the interactions for the sake of circumventing those masculine principles. The masculine dominant comes in with their own masculine principles and foundation, And oftentimes, because the masculine submissive hasn't integrated their shadow well enough to operate primarily out of the submissive ego or primarily out of the dominant ego through competence, or the submissive ego through intrinsic desire and intrinsic reward, the fact that the masculine dominant has integrated the shadow will be falsely seen as feminine dominance to the masculine submissive. Important concept to understand, right? And now how can that look? That can look like a woman who sees a dude who's direct about his sexual intentions as a fuckboy, but sees a dude who is willing to wine and dine and be inconsistent with her, and then to disappear on her, and then to desire sex with that man due to his inconsistency. That's just a dude who she wants, right? That's goofy bitch shit, right? Still gonna end up doing the same thing at the end of the day, but not wanting an individual who's going to be honest with you about it. But if they were willing to manipulate you, you'd be down for it. And I think that sometimes what occurs for many men who find themselves in a state of feminine dominance is that throughout their life experiences, being masculine submissive didn't work, and they thought that they were being honest when they really weren't being honest with themselves enough to be honest with someone else, and didn't know how to make themselves intrinsically desirable. So they might try to do the wine and dine and relationship shit, and try to trade emotional validation, social validation, financial investment for sex. And then when that doesn't work, they find themselves in a position where they are, say, you know what? Trying to like these women ain't doing nothing. So they say, you know what? Let me just start manipulating. Oftentimes, feminine dominance is a man's introduction into knowing what it feels like to be dominant. The introduction into coming in contact with the dominant ego, the dominant sexual ego. But it's when an individual applies structure to it that really tests the validity of that intrinsic desirability and respectability, right? That's what really tests it. When you're in a position where you give a woman the opportunity to just be honest with her and let her decide for herself what she wants to do with it, right? That's when you're stepping into masculine dominance. When you have principles and structures about the way you interact and you put those to the fire, right? That's when you're stepping more into masculine dominance. When you have standards, that's when you're putting masculine dominance to the test. When you're direct with women, that's when you're putting masculine dominance to the test, right? And understand, like I said, in long-term relationships, masculine dominance won't be enough. Once you're in a position where you're emotionally invested, you no longer desire to just walk away, and you want that to be something long-term, right? That's when you have to operate out of the integrated masculine, right? So I'd say that a great person to watch on YouTube about the integrated masculine energy would be Jeffrey Setawan, right? Jeffrey Setawan would be a great person to watch. If you're like prematurely integrated, and through your premature integration, you hear me talk about masculine dominance. Masculine dominance is more so a game up front. There's a price that you have to pay for not knowing yourself when you first meet a woman. There's a price you have to pay for not knowing how to make yourself intrinsically desirable and respectable. There's a price you have to pay for not having established your principles or having integrated your shadow before you met a woman to speak directly to her shadow. There's a price you have to pay for missing the stage of novelty to establish sexual compatibility. There's a price you have to pay for dealing with a woman who hasn't yet integrated her own sexual shadow, right? And that price is you have a certain window of time when you first meet a woman to establish your program before you trying to then establish your program feels like feminine dominance. It feels like you're moving the goalpost. It feels like you're expecting more while giving less. In that stage, your choice is to walk away or to actually learn how to communicate and to create that safety, to create that emotional safety, to create those feelings of a woman feeling open and expressive to you. right? To walk on your square as a man. And the truth is this, there are some instances where you can be masculine submissive for a period of time and use a little bit of feminine dominance to transition into the masculine dominance with a woman. A lot of those situations won't work if you kill too much of the safety along the way. If you kill too much of the safety along the way, then it may not work. But there are instances where it can work like that, just through that progression. And watch my video on the 3 stages of sexual integration. But this is Coach Brody. I'm out.